So back in 2007, cinephiles around the world kind of suffered this trauma of having both Antonioni and Ingmar Bergman, two titans of world cinema, die in the same day, basically. Um, More recently, we've had Eric Romer and Claude Chabrol pass away in the same year, which is kind of equally traumatic too. That's you know, 2/3 of the French New Wave, which Francois Truffaut is already gone, and Jacques Rivette is unfortunately not doing too well. So this is sort of we've a turnaround period where a new generation, the generation that came after Antonioni, are inheriting the place, that kind of charged place. They're big shoes to fill. Whether you like Antonioni or Bergman or you don't like them, there's still big shoes to fill. I remember the night that I found out that Antonioni had passed away. I had assembled some clips to show of friends, um, and we got together in somebody's patio late at night. It was in the middle of the summer, so it was nice out, and we fired up the projector, and the scenes that came to mind were the scene at the end of Zabriskie Point, um, the scene where Jimmy Plant appears in Blow Up, and the guitar gets smashed, and David Hemmings fights to get that piece of guitar, and then finally, when he's outside of the concert hall, he just kind of chucks it away. The final scene of The Passenger and so forth. It was much harder to kind of figure out a moment from the early work to show. You really have to kind of concentrate on its entirety. They didn't have those kind of key moments that you could take away from the film. They were less kind of show-offy in that way and harder to place, and it makes them more exciting. I mean, of course, that night what we wanted to do was kind of similar to what they do on the Oscars when they're paying tribute to somebody. You do a clip reel. And one of the strengths of 50s Antonioni is that it's very hard to do a clip reel of 50s Antonioni. There isn't like a lot of there aren't a lot of scenes that kind of just stick out in that same way. You really, to get the essence of it, you have to watch the whole thing. You really have to experience these early films. These are not sort of experiences that one walks away from and just says, well, that worked. That was kind of satisfying. That wasn't the idea in Antonioni. He wanted to kind of contrast his worldview and his sensibility with yours. And so you go to a lot of film festivals and you talk to a lot of people about Antonioni, and either they're kind of yay or nay, or they like some films or they don't like others. And that speaks to the complexity of the work. It speaks to Antonioni's ultimate aim, I think, as an artist. And even while the later films are sort of abandoned, you can still see the same Antonioni, the same kind of vulnerability coming through. The early films kind of occult that vulnerability. And again, this is somebody who's trying to rise within the film industry. And so he doesn't want to show that. A lot of producers, I mean, especially in the climate of 1950s Italy, which arguably continues to be a very macho culture. You had to prove yourself kind of within that culture, not only commercially, but you had to show that you were strong-willed. The same thing was happening in Hollywood. Strong-willed directors were usually the most successful ones within the studio system. So how does kind of a vulnerable, self-doubting director who's always questioning the world, is very kind of pessimistic about the world, sees a lot of disconnect, how does that person kind of position himself within a film industry where none of that is really tolerated, or at least looked at with as virtuous, or as something that you could cultivate for a film, or in the case of an industry, a product that you could shape and market and so forth. Well, for Antonioni, that was sort of the struggle. That's the struggle of the 50s films. That's what makes them vibrant, and what makes them kind of great works of art, because they are struggling with these with these issues, just like the Renaissance painters, centuries before, were struggling with the arts patrons who financed their work, and were smuggling in ideas as well, and were sometimes successful at that and sometimes not. And what makes those kind of lasting masterworks, because whenever we're talking about films, we're also talking about these kind of commercial considerations. I mean, after all, we know that film is an expensive art form. I'm not going to say it's the most expensive art form, because that's no longer true. Painting and photography and making video games, anything is kind of expensive now at a certain level. The interesting thing is that for a director who's so hyper aware of what he's doing, and who's really kind of, his craft is evolving at such a surprising pace. This is a guy who really kind of actively disparaged having any kind of formal education in the arts. He studied, I believe it was economics in school at the University of Bologna. But as the legend goes, he only did that. He only went to university because he was following the girl that he loved at the time. And so Antonioni kind of came into film in this sort of strange way, where, in the 1940s, like most Italian men his age, he was enlisted into the military for war service. And he found a way kind of out of this, working on different directors' projects, including one by Rossellini, and eventually making his own documentary subjects. So Antonioni kind of, he was going after a different route. He was definitely not your kind of typical studious kid. He was more of kind of a rebel from all accounts, and he went into filmmaking in a way that was a bit atypical for the time. Of course, it was very typical to go into these sort of apprenticeships to actually learn how to make films. What was sort of atypical is that Antonioni could have gone to school for a long time. He could have performed his military service in any number of different capacities, but naturally he gravitated towards film. We don't really know why or how or what caught his attention about film, why he gravitated towards film. So that's always going to be a mystery when we're discussing Antonioni's life. But films are actually kind of, they surge from this kind of commercial impetus, and they stayed that way, and arguably have stayed that way for a long time. And for an Antonioni to exist and to produce his art in the 1950s would have been nearly impossible had he not conformed in a certain way. There were other directors who were working in the documentary form that we've talked about a little bit before, and that was a way, a kind of low-pressure way of making movies, where you could learn the craft and get your foot in the door without necessarily risking a lot commercially. But for Antonioni, that wasn't enough. Antonioni had already worked with Rossellini on some of his films during the war. He had an experience working with Marcel Carné in the early 40s, and then immediately went on to make his own films. And he was also constantly, and this is something that's kind of little known and little remarked on in a lot of the Antonioni biographies and different reviews, is that he was kind of, he was not a studio man, but he was a guy who, he's let's say, situated within the Italian film industry in such a way that people kind of relied on him to help them out, other directors and so forth. So he would come in and do second unit shooting for different directors on action films, historical films, Sword and Sandals films. He was very active doing all of that because this was a way for him to earn his freedom, and also to kind of experiment with the actual craft of making movies. Although those didn't kind of turn up in his films at the end, those elements, those commercial elements, were always kind of kept away from his own projects, which we could look at in their entirety nowadays and say those are pretty personal films. Even the 50s films, I think if you take a look at all of them, they're all very personal in a way. I mean, there is not an odd one in the bunch. Um, and this is a director, you can count him up. Dramatic fictional features, he's got about 15 of them. And all of them are remarkable works. None of them are films that any director would discredit. They're all films that show that Antonioni is an artist worthy of his time and maybe worthy of our time and future generations.